Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything. Sometimes saving a stranger's life means risking your own peaceful world. In 1883, twin brothers Josiah and Benjamin Harwick live alone in the Colorado mountains. They are trappers who keep to themselves after losing everything they once loved. When they find a young woman nearly frozen to death in a blizzard, they bring her to their cabin. They don't ask questions, they just try to save her life. For days, the storm rages while they nurse her back to health. But this woman isn't just any lost traveler. She's running from a powerful family in Denver. When the snow clears, men with guns will come looking for her. The brothers will have to choose between their quiet life and protecting someone who has become important to them. What happens when doing the right thing puts everything at risk? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frozen locket lay beside the unconscious woman's hand, its delicate gold chain catching the firelight like a whispered secret. Benjamin Harwick noticed it first as he carefully peeled away her ice-crusted gloves, but said nothing. In 15 years of mountain living, he'd learned that some mysteries revealed themselves in their own time. Outside their cabin, the Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly, under a blanket of snow so deep it swallowed sound itself. The wind howled through towering pines, like the voices of all the ghosts they'd left behind in the world below. Inside, warmth radiated from a stone fireplace that Benjamin had built with his own hands, each rock chosen and placed with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Josiah Harwick moved with quiet efficiency around their one-room sanctuary, heating water and gathering clean cloth. At 42, he was older than his twin by 7 minutes, a fact Benjamin never let him forget during their rare moments of levity. Where Benjamin possessed an artist's hands and a philosopher's mind, Josiah carried the practical wisdom of a man who'd learned to read weather patterns in cloud formations and danger in the way animals moved through the forest. Their cabin sat like a prayer among the pines, 8 miles from the nearest trail and 23 from the closest town. They'd built it themselves in the summer of 1868, when grief still sat heavy on their shoulders, and the world below held nothing but painful memories. The structure reflected their dual nature, sturdy and functional, like Josiah's mindset, yet beautiful in its simplicity, like Benjamin's carved chess set that waited on a corner table. The chess pieces told their own story of long winter nights and the need for mental stimulation in their chosen isolation. Each figure had been whittled during blizzards, much like this one, when the brothers sat by the fire and let their hands work while their minds wandered. The king wore the face of their father, lost to consumption when they were 25. The queen bore their mother's gentle smile, carved from memory after a fever took her the following winter. The pawns represented the farm workers they'd once employed, honest men who'd found other work when the Harwick brothers could no longer pay wages. Her breathing steadier, Josiah observed, checking the woman's pulse with the gentle touch of someone who'd tended wounded animals for years. But she's still burning with fever. Benjamin nodded, stirring a pot of herbal tea their mother had taught them to brew. Wild mint and elderflower, gathered during the brief mountain summer and dried in careful bundles. The hypothermia's breaking, but her body's fighting something else. Look at her hands. Josiah examined the woman's fingers more closely. Soft as silk despite the cold, with nails that spoke of a life free from manual labor. Her dress, though torn and stained from her ordeal, had been cut from fabric that cost more than most men earned in a month. Everything about her whispered of wealth and privilege, of a world the brothers had deliberately left behind. She's running from something, Benjamin said quietly, settling into his chair beside the fire. Or someone. Aren't we all? Their own flight from civilization had begun with the loss of everything they'd built together. The Harwick farm had been their father's legacy, 500 acres of rich Colorado soil that had sustained 3 generations. They'd worked it side by side, planning to marry local girls and raise families in the shadow of the mountains. But drought came, followed by locusts, then creditors with papers and badges, and no mercy for men who'd given everything to the land. The final blow came when Margaret Wilson, Josiah's intended bride, married the banker's son instead. Not for love, her tearful letter explained, but for security her father couldn't provide after the bank foreclosed on their farm too. Benjamin had watched his brother read that letter by lamplight, saw something break inside him that never quite healed. They'd left together the next morning, carrying only what fit in 2 packs and a shared understanding that the world below held nothing for them anymore. 15 years had passed since then. 15 years of hunting and trapping, of cutting timber and trading furs at the seasonal camps. They'd become legends among the other mountain men, the Harwick twins, who could track a wounded bear through a blizzard, who never missed a shot, who honored their word like scripture. Their reputation opened doors and settled disputes, but they remained apart even from that rough fraternity, bound together by loss and a quiet code that needed no words. Their daily routines had become ritual. Josiah rose before dawn to check the trap lines, moving through the forest with the silent grace of a predator. Benjamin tended their small garden during growing season, preserved meat for winter, and crafted the tools and furniture that made their isolation bearable. Evenings belonged to conversation, chess, and the books they'd salvaged from their old life volumes of Shakespeare and Thoreau, technical manuals on farming and animal husbandry, their mother's Bible with its worn leather binding. The cabin itself reflected their commitment to self-sufficiency. Solar exposure had been calculated to maximize winter warmth while providing summer shade. The roof, angled precisely to shed snow, bore cedar shakes they'd cut and shaped themselves. Inside, every inch served a purpose. Shelves for preserved food, hooks for tools and clothing, a workbench where Benjamin carved and Josiah maintained their weapons. The single luxury was space. They'd built the cabin larger than necessary because cramped quarters led to conflict, and conflict could kill when the nearest help was days away. Their moral code had evolved from necessity and shared trauma. They took only what they needed from the forest, never more. They helped other travelers when possible, asking nothing in return. They settled disputes with words when possible, action when necessary, but never with unnecessary violence. Most importantly, they protected each other above all else, a brotherhood forged in loss and tempered by isolation. The woman stirred, murmuring something in her delirium. Benjamin leaned closer, catching fragments of words that spoke of Denver's grand mansions and gaslit streets. Her fever dreams painted pictures of ballrooms and business meetings, of a father's love and a suitor's unwanted attention. She spoke a name, Cornelius, with a mixture of affection and frustration that told its own story. "She's educated," Benjamin observed. "Listen to her speech patterns. Classical training, expensive tutors." Josiah nodded grimly. "Which means people will come looking for her, wealthy people with resources and connections." They both understood the implications. Their carefully constructed isolation depended on anonymity, on being forgotten by the world below. A missing rich girl would bring searchers, questions, attention they couldn't afford. Yet the alternative, turning her out into the storm, violated everything they believed about human decency. The storm outside intensified, wind driving snow against their windows with increasing fury. Josiah checked their supplies, dried meat, preserved vegetables, flour, coffee, calculating how long they could sustain 3 people if the weather held. Benjamin added another log to the fire, watching sparks dance up the chimney like tiny prayers. "We'll keep her alive," Josiah said finally. "Whatever comes after, we can live with. But we couldn't live with letting her die." Benjamin smiled, recognizing the echo of their father's voice in his brother's words. John Harwick had been a man who believed in doing right, regardless of cost. A philosophy that had ultimately cost him everything, but had also shaped his sons into men of honor. The woman's breathing steadied as the herbal tea took effect. Color returned to her cheeks, and her shivering subsided. Whatever battles she'd been fighting in her fever dreams seemed to ease, replaced by the deep sleep of genuine healing. The frozen locket beside her hand caught the firelight again, its surface warming slowly in the cabin's gentle heat. Outside, the blizzard raged on, sealing them all in together, with whatever secrets and consequences morning might bring. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight, three strangers had found sanctuary in the vast wilderness of the human heart. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices between safety and honor. Tonight, they simply endured together, bound by the ancient covenant between those who help and those who need help, a covenant older than law, stronger than fear, and more enduring than the storm that howled beyond their walls. The silk dress, torn and stained with snow and mud, told a story of desperate flight through wilderness that had never known such finery. Benjamin fingered the expensive fabric as he carefully cut it away from the woman's frozen limbs, marveling at how something so beautiful could survive such violence. The deep emerald color spoke of Denver's finest shops, of a world where appearance mattered more than warmth, where fashion trumped function. Here in their mountain sanctuary, it seemed as foreign as a peacock feather in a wolf's den. The rescue itself had been a thing of brutal necessity and practiced efficiency. Josiah had found her first, following wolf tracks along the ridge trail when the storm began its furious assault on the mountains. He'd been checking their furthest trapline, racing against the weather that promised to bury the high country for days. The wolves had found her scent before him, their excited yipping drawing his attention to what looked like a snow-covered log beside the narrow pass. But logs didn't wear silk dresses or clutch gold lockets with the desperation of the dying. She'd been unconscious when he reached her, her lips blue with cold, and her breathing so shallow he'd feared she was already gone. Her horse was nowhere to be seen, either fled in panic or buried somewhere in the growing drifts. Tracks around her position told the story of a hard fall, perhaps when her mount stumbled on the treacherous footing. How long she'd lain there was impossible to determine, but the ice crystals in her hair suggested hours rather than minutes. Josiah had gathered her in his arms like a child, surprised by how light she felt, despite her tall frame. Wealth, he'd learned from his past life, often came with the privilege of never knowing real hunger. Her bones felt delicate beneath his calloused hands, bred for ballrooms rather than survival. Yet, something in her face, even unconscious and half-frozen, spoke of hidden strength, of a will that had carried her this far into the wilderness when comfort and safety beckoned from the valley below. The journey back to the cabin had tested every skill their mountain years had taught them. The trail disappeared beneath wind-driven snow that stung like needles and cut visibility to mere yards. Josiah had navigated by instinct and memory, feeling for familiar landmarks with his feet while protecting the woman's face from the worst of the storm. Twice he'd stumbled in drifts deeper than expected, nearly dropping his precious burden into snow that would have claimed them both. Benjamin had been watching for his return from their single window, anxiety growing as the storm's fury increased beyond anything they'd seen in years. When Josiah finally emerged from the white chaos, like a ghost made solid, carrying what looked like a bundle of expensive rags, Benjamin had thrown open their door without question. Questions could wait, survival demanded immediate action. They'd stripped away her frozen clothing with the clinical efficiency of men who dressed wounds and tended sick animals. Modesty was a luxury neither the dying nor their rescuers could afford. Her undergarments, fine as spider silk, had frozen to her skin in places, requiring careful warming before they could be removed without tearing flesh. Each layer revealed more evidence of her privileged origins, stays crafted by master corset makers, chemises sewn with thread that caught light like silver, stockings so fine they seemed woven from morning mist. But beneath the finery lay the stark reality of hypothermia's grip. Her skin had taken on the waxy pallor of advancing cold, mottled with patches of white that spoke of frostbite's early stages. Her pulse fluttered weak and irregular beneath Benjamin's searching fingers. Most alarming was her core temperature, so low that any rapid warming could shock her heart into stopping forever. They'd wrapped her in their warmest blankets and positioned her near the fire, but not too close. Benjamin had seen men die from well-meaning rescuers who'd tried to warm frozen flesh too quickly, watching helplessly as blood vessels burst like overpressured pipes. Instead, they'd used body heat and warm cloths, taking turns lying beside her to share their warmth while monitoring every breath and heartbeat. The first sign of returning life had come as a violent shivering that shook the entire bed frame. Benjamin had held her steady while Josiah prepared warm broth, drop by drop, between chattering teeth. She'd fought them unconsciously, her body rejecting the very help it desperately needed. They'd persisted with gentle patience, understanding that the transition back from death's threshold was never easy or peaceful. Her delirium had begun as the fever took hold, her body's desperate attempt to burn away the cold that had nearly claimed her. She'd spoken in fragments, names and places that painted pictures of a life lived in gilded comfort. "Father, please understand," she'd whispered to empty air. "I cannot marry a man I do not love." The words had carried such anguish that both brothers had exchanged meaningful glances across her bedside. Between fevered outbursts, they'd pieced together fragments of her story. She'd mentioned Denver's Grand Central Hotel, the Union Club, where powerful men made decisions that shaped the territory's future. A name had emerged repeatedly, Remington, spoken with the mixture of love and exasperation that marked family relationships strained by opposing wills. She was running from something, that much was clear. Something that had driven her to risk death in the wilderness rather than face whatever waited in civilization. The expensive riding habit she'd worn told its own tale of desperate flight. Cut for show rather than warmth, it had been wholly inadequate for mountain weather. The boots were tooled leather masterpieces that had never known mud or stones before their owner's wild ride into the high country. Everything about her preparation, or lack thereof, spoke of a decision made in haste, driven by desperation rather than careful planning. "She's not just wealthy," Benjamin had observed during one of their quiet consultations while she slept. "She's connected. The kind of connected that brings federal marshals when someone goes missing." Josiah had nodded grimly, understanding the implications for their carefully guarded isolation. "We could be charged with kidnapping just for helping her." Yet neither brother had seriously considered turning her away once she was found. Their code wouldn't permit abandoning anyone to die in the wilderness, regardless of the consequences. They'd made their choice the moment Josiah had lifted her from the snow, accepting whatever complications her presence might bring. As the storm outside reached its full fury, rattling their shutters and piling snow against their door, they'd settled into the rhythm of caring for someone whose very existence threatened everything they'd built. They took turns monitoring her condition, forcing liquid between her lips when consciousness briefly returned, adjusting blankets when her shivering became too violent. The contrast between her refinement and their rough mountain home had been stark and somehow beautiful. Her delicate features looked almost ethereal against their hand-sewn pillows, like a princess from the fairy tales their mother had read them as children. Yet there was strength in the set of her jaw, determination in the way her hands had clutched that locket, even in unconsciousness. Whatever had driven her to risk death in the mountains, it had required courage that many men would have lacked. By the second day, her fever had broken enough for brief moments of clarity. She'd looked around their cabin with wonder rather than fear, taking in the rough-hewn walls and handmade furniture with eyes that spoke of intelligence and adaptability. When she'd tried to speak, they'd given her water instead of answers, understanding that healing required rest more than conversation. Where she'd begun, her voice hoarse from cold and fever. "Safe," Josiah had replied simply, "Rest now. Questions can wait." She'd nodded and closed her eyes, but not before both brothers had seen something that made their hearts skip gratitude so pure and profound it seemed to illuminate her entire face. Whatever else she might be, whatever complications her presence might bring, she was someone who understood the value of kindness freely given. The storm raged on around their sanctuary, sealing them all together in a space that suddenly felt both more crowded and more complete than it had in 15 years. The silver hairbrush emerged from her saddlebags like a whisper from another world, its ornate handle catching the morning light that streamed through their cabin's single window. Benjamin turned it over in his weathered hands, studying the intricate crest engraved in its surface, a soaring eagle clutching arrows and olive branches, surrounded by scrollwork that spoke of old money and older power. The letter R sat prominently at the center, confirming what her fevered words had already suggested. "Remington," he said quietly, showing the brush to Josiah as their patient slept peacefully for the first time in 3 days. Josiah whistled low under his breath. Even in their mountain isolation, they'd heard stories of Cornelius Remington, railroad baron, mining magnate, a man whose decisions could make or break entire towns. If this woman belonged to that family, her disappearance would bring more than just searchers. It would bring an army. She stirred as they spoke, consciousness returning gradually like dawn breaking over the peaks. Her eyes a striking green that reminded Benjamin of deep forest pools, focused first on the rough-hewn ceiling, then swept the cabin with intelligent assessment. When her gaze found the 2 men standing beside her bed, she showed no fear, only cautious gratitude. "You saved my life," she said, her voice still hoarse, but carrying the cultured tones of expensive education. "I remember the storm, falling from my horse. After that, you've been unconscious for 3 days, Josiah explained gently. "The hypothermia nearly took you." She tried to sit up, wincing as movement reminded her of injuries both old and new. Benjamin moved quickly to support her, noting how she accepted his help without the usual aristocratic reluctance to be touched by rough hands. Whatever had driven her into the wilderness had also stripped away some of society's more foolish pretensions. "I'm Isabel," she said, offering only her given name, "and I'm deeply in your debt." "Josiah Harwick," he replied, indicating his brother. "Benjamin, we don't take payment for helping folks in need." Her smile transformed her entire face, revealing the warmth and humor that expensive portraits never quite captured. "I suspect you don't take payment for much of anything up here. This place, it's like something from a storybook." Benjamin felt an unexpected flush of pride at her obvious appreciation for their home. Most visitors from the civilized world saw only roughness and deprivation, where Isabel seemed to recognize craftsmanship and careful thought. Her gaze lingered on his carved chess set, the fitted joints of their furniture, the way every detail had been considered for both function and beauty. "You built this yourselves," she observed. "It wasn't a question. 15 years ago," Josiah confirmed, "been adding to it ever since. It's beautiful." She meant it, he could tell. "I've seen mansions in Denver that weren't half so welcoming." The mention of Denver hung in the air between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Benjamin held up the silver brush, watching her expression carefully. "This fell from your bags, the crest. Belongs to my father." She took the brush with hands that trembled slightly, whether from weakness or emotion he couldn't tell. "Cornelius Remington. I suppose you've heard the name." Both brothers nodded. Everyone in Colorado had heard of Cornelius Remington, the man who'd built an empire from nothing and ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. What they hadn't expected was the pain that crossed her features when she spoke of him. "I ran away," she said simply, "from an engagement party, from a marriage I cannot accept." "To whom?" Benjamin asked gently. "Harrison Blackthorne. Do you know that name as well?" Josiah's jaw tightened. Even mountain hermits heard stories about Harrison Blackthorne railroad money from back east, political connections that reached Washington, a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. Not a man any father should force on his daughter, regardless of business advantages. "I love my father," Isabel continued, staring into the fire as if seeing visions there. "But he sees this marriage as necessary for our family's survival. Blackthorne has leverage over some of our business dealings, debts that could destroy everything father has built. He's offered to forgive them in exchange for my hand." "And you refused?" Benjamin said. I ran. Her laugh held no humor, like a child afraid of a scolding. "But I couldn't. I won't sacrifice my life to save his business empire." The brothers exchanged glances over her head. They understood something about running from impossible situations, about choosing the wilderness over compromise, with a world that demanded too much. But they also understood the complications her presence brought to their own carefully constructed peace. "He'll be looking for you," Josiah said carefully. "I know. I hoped foolishly, perhaps that if I disappeared long enough, he might find another solution, or Blackthorne might lose interest in a bride who clearly doesn't want him." Benjamin watched her fingers worry the silver brush's handle, noting the calluses that spoke of recent riding despite her soft upbringing. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning suggests more preparation than I managed," she admitted ruefully. "I've been considering it for weeks, but the actual decision came suddenly. The engagement announcement was to be published the morning after the party. I couldn't bear to wake up and see my future written in newspaper ink." She looked around their cabin again, and Benjamin saw her truly taking in their isolation for the first time. No gas lights or running water, no servants or modern conveniences. Just two men and the life they'd built with their own hands, far from everything she'd known. "You must think me terribly foolish," she said, a pampered rich girl playing at adventure. "We think you're brave," Josiah replied honestly. "Foolish maybe, but brave. It takes courage to choose uncertainty over security, even when the security comes with chains." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "Thank you for that. And for saving my life when you could have simply passed by." "We don't pass by folks in need," Benjamin said simply. "It's not our way." Over the following days, as her strength returned, Isabel proved herself more resilient than her refined appearance suggested. She insisted on helping with simple tasks despite their protests, learning to tend the fire and prepare basic meals with the enthusiasm of someone discovering hidden talents. Her questions about their survival techniques came from genuine curiosity rather than condescending amazement. "How do you know which plants are safe to eat?" she asked, watching Benjamin sort through dried herbs. "Experience, mostly, and some hard lessons early on." He showed her the different varieties, explaining their uses and effects. "Mother taught us some. The rest we learned from other mountain folk and trial and error. Your mother lived here too?" "No." Benjamin's voice grew soft. "She died before we came to the mountains, but her teaching came with us." Isabel seemed to understand that some stories required time and trust before the telling. Instead, she asked about practical things, how they preserved meat for winter, where they got supplies, how they navigated in heavy snow. Her questions revealed a mind that grasped concepts quickly and filed away information for future use. Watching her adapt to their simple life, both brothers began to see past the expensive clothes and cultured speech to the intelligent, determined woman beneath. She might have been born to privilege, but she possessed the strength to survive without it when survival became necessary. The storm outside was finally beginning to ease, but none of them spoke of what that might mean. Josiah's leather journal lay open on the small table between them, its pages filled with pressed wildflowers and careful observations about the changing seasons. He'd never shown it to anyone before, but something about Isabel's genuine interest in their mountain life had loosened his usual reserve. The journal represented 15 years of quiet contemplation, a record of beauty found in isolation that most people would never understand. "Wild columbine," he said softly, pointing to a delicate blue flower preserved between sheets of thin paper, "blooms for maybe 2 weeks in July, up near the tree line. Most folks never see them because they don't venture that high." Isabel traced the flower's outline with one finger, careful not to disturb the fragile petals. "It's beautiful. You pressed it perfectly. Look how the color stayed true." The firelight danced across her face as she studied each page, revealing an expression of wonder that touched something deep in Josiah's chest. She appreciated things that others might dismiss as simple mountain weeds, seeing the artistry in his careful preservation of fleeting beauty. "This one," she said, pausing at a page near the journal's beginning. "What is it?" "Mountain laurel. Grew near our mother's grave. We buried her before coming up here." His voice caught slightly on the words. "Benjamin thought I was foolish for pressing it, but I wanted something to remember how she loved flowers. It's not foolish at all." Isabel's eyes held the kind of understanding that came from her own experiences with loss. Beautiful things deserve to be preserved, especially when they connect us to people we've loved. Benjamin watched this exchange from his chair by the fire, whittling a new pawn for his chess set. The old king had been damaged during their last move to the cabin, and he'd been meaning to replace it for months. His hands worked automatically, while his mind focused on the subtle shift in atmosphere that had occurred over the past few days. Isabel's presence had changed their evening routines in ways both obvious and profound. Where once they'd sat in comfortable silence or discussed practical matters, now their conversations ranged across topics they hadn't explored in years. She asked thoughtful questions about their past, sharing pieces of her own story in return, building bridges of understanding between their vastly different worlds. "Tell me about the farm," she said one evening, as Benjamin served stew made from venison and preserved vegetables. "What was it like before you came here?" Josiah set down his spoon, considering how to explain a life that felt like someone else's memory. 500 acres of the richest soil in Colorado Territory. Our father built it from nothing, worked himself into an early grave, proving that hard work and honest dealing could create something lasting. But it didn't last, Benjamin added quietly. Drought, locusts, then the bank. In the end, all that work meant nothing when the papers came. "I'm sorry." Isabel's sympathy was genuine, unmarked by the polite condescension they might have expected from someone of her background. Losing a family legacy must have been devastating. "We lost more than land," Josiah admitted. "I was engaged to be married, Margaret Wilson, the banker's daughter. When her father's bank took our farm, she married someone else for security. She wrote you a letter," Benjamin said gently, understanding that some stories needed to be told completely or not at all. "Said she loved me but couldn't survive on love alone. Her father had debts too, needed a son-in-law who could pay them." Josiah's voice carried old pain that had mellowed into acceptance over the years. "Can't say I blame her for choosing security over uncertainty." Isabel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I suppose we're not so different then. You ran from a world that valued money over love, and I'm running from the same thing. Except we had nothing to lose by leaving," Benjamin pointed out. "You're giving up everything." "Am I?" She looked around, their cabin with eyes that seemed to catalogue every handmade detail. "Or am I discovering that everything I thought mattered actually doesn't?" The conversation had continued long into the night, each revelation creating deeper understanding between them. Isabel spoke of growing up in a mansion that felt more like a museum, surrounded by beautiful things that couldn't be touched or enjoyed. She described dinner parties where business deals mattered more than human connections, where her value as a daughter was measured entirely by her ability to make advantageous marriages. "I used to sneak out to visit the kitchen staff," she confided. "Their children played games and told stories, while mine were conducted like military exercises designed to teach proper deportment." "Did you ever have friends your own age?" Benjamin asked. Other girls from suitable families, yes, but friendship requires honesty, and I was never allowed to be honest about anything that mattered. We discussed fashion and gossip while our fathers negotiated which of us would marry which sons to benefit their business interests. Josiah found himself studying her face in the firelight, noting how animated she became when discussing things that truly interested her. Her questions about survival techniques and wilderness lore came from genuine curiosity, not idle politeness. When she helped with cabin tasks, her movements showed increasing confidence and skill. "You're a natural at this," he observed one afternoon as she successfully started a fire on her third attempt. "Perhaps because it's the first useful skill anyone's ever allowed me to learn," she replied with a rueful smile. "In Denver, ladies aren't supposed to know how anything actually works. We're meant to be decorative and agreeable, nothing more." "That seems like a waste," Benjamin said, meaning it. "You've got a good mind and steady hands. Could probably learn anything you set your heart to." The compliment brought color to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. "Thank you for saying that. Most men in my social circle prefer women who ask no questions and express no opinions." "Most men are fools," Josiah said simply. Their eyes met across the small space, and something passed between them that made Benjamin quietly excuse himself to check their wood supply. He'd seen the growing attraction between his brother and their unexpected guest, watched it develop through shared conversations and small kindnesses. Rather than jealousy, he felt a quiet satisfaction that Josiah might finally have found someone worthy of his careful heart. Outside, the storm had finally begun to ease after 4 days of relentless fury. Snow still fell, but gently now, adding to drifts that reached nearly to their windows. The silence felt different, somehow expectant rather than oppressive, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. When Benjamin returned to the cabin, he found Josiah showing Isabel how to read the chess pieces' carved faces. Her fingers traced the tiny features with the reverence of someone who understood that art could be found in the simplest things, that beauty didn't require a museum or a price tag to have value. "This is your mother," she said, holding the queen piece up to the light. "As I remember her," Josiah confirmed. "Benjamin carved it from memory the winter after we arrived. She looks kind and strong." She was both. Watching them together, Benjamin felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, hope for a future that included more than just survival and solitude. The wanted poster crackled in Benjamin's weathered hands like dry leaves, its bold black letters announcing a reward that made both brothers exchange worried glances. $1,000 for information leading to the safe return of Miss Isabel Remington, last seen fleeing Denver on horseback during a severe winter storm. The amount represented more money than most mountain folk saw in 5 years, enough to turn friends into bounty hunters and transform their isolated sanctuary into the center of a manhunt. Josiah had found the poster nailed to a tree near their furthest trapline, one of dozens that searchers had spread throughout the high country. The paper was expensive, waterproofed against mountain weather, with Isabel's likeness rendered in precise detail by an artist who'd clearly worked from multiple sittings. Even in black ink, her intelligence and determination showed through, making it impossible for anyone who'd seen her to claim ignorance. "They're getting closer," Josiah said quietly as they studied the poster by lamplight while Isabel slept. "Found fresh horse tracks near the ridge trail, maybe 2 days old. Professional trackers, from the look of them." Benjamin nodded grimly. "Saw smoke from 3 different camps yesterday when I was checking the eastern approaches. They're working a grid pattern, systematic as military scouts. The magnitude of the search effort had become clear over the past week as signs of outside presence multiplied throughout their territory. Men who knew the mountains were combing every trail, checking every cabin, questioning every trapper and prospector they encountered. The reward money ensured cooperation from folks who might otherwise have minded their own business. "Read the fine print," Benjamin said, pointing to smaller text beneath Isabel's portrait. Josiah squinted in the lamplight. Miss Remington is believed to be suffering from a nervous condition that has affected her judgment. Anyone harboring her whereabouts may be charged with kidnapping under territorial law. Contact Sheriff Morrison in Denver immediately upon discovery. Nervous condition, Benjamin repeated with disgust. Makes it sound like she's lost her mind instead of making a rational choice about her own life. And the kidnapping charge means we can't just walk her down to the nearest town and explain. They'll arrest us first and ask questions later. They both understood the legal reality facing them. In the eyes of Colorado Territory law, a woman of Isabel's social standing couldn't be considered capable of making independent decisions about her whereabouts. Her father's wealth and political connections would ensure that anyone found helping her disappearance would face serious criminal charges, regardless of her own testimony. Isabel stirred in her sleep, murmuring words they couldn't quite catch. The past few days had brought back some of her color and strength, but also a growing awareness of the impossible situation her presence created for them. She'd seen the worry in their faces, caught fragments of their whispered conversations about search parties and legal consequences. "We need to tell her," Josiah said finally. "Tell me what?" Isabel's voice came from the bed, surprising them both. She sat up slowly, pulling their spare blanket around her. "Shoulders like armor. I've been awake for several minutes, long enough to hear about wanted posters and kidnapping charges." Benjamin handed her the paper without comment, watching her face as she read her own description. Her jaw tightened when she reached the part about nervous conditions, but she showed no surprise at the legal threats facing anyone who helped her. $1,000, she said finally. "Father's not taking any chances." "It's enough to make anyone think twice about keeping secrets," Josiah pointed out. "Including you?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went beyond simple inquiry. "We're not in this for money," Benjamin replied firmly. "Never have been, but we need to understand what we're facing." Isabel set the poster aside and looked directly at both brothers. "What you're facing is association with a woman whose family has more power than sense and more money than morality. The nervous condition claim gives them legal justification to force me home regardless of my own wishes. And the kidnapping threat ensures that anyone who helps me will be treated as a criminal. They can't actually prove kidnapping if you testify that you came here willingly," Josiah argued. "Can't they?" Isabel's smile held no humor. "Harrison Blackthorne has judges in his pocket from here to Washington. My testimony would be dismissed as evidence of my mental instability, and you'd be portrayed as mountain savages who took advantage of a confused rich girl." The brothers absorbed this information in troubled silence. They'd understood that helping her carried risks, but the full scope of their potential legal jeopardy was becoming clear only now. In the world below, money and influence could reshape reality to suit the powerful, and truth became whatever served their interests. "So what do you propose?" Benjamin asked carefully. "I propose you let me leave before they find this place. I'll take my chances in the wilderness, rather than bring disaster down on the men who saved my life." "Absolutely not," Josiah said with a firmness that surprised even him. "You'd be dead inside a week, and we'd never forgive ourselves." "Better me dead than all three of us in chains," she replied pragmatically. "There's another option," Benjamin said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. "We could disappear together, head deeper into the mountains, find territory the searchers haven't reached yet." Isabel stared at him. "You'd abandon your home? Everything you've built here?" "We've done it before," Josiah reminded her. "Left everything behind when staying became impossible. This cabin's just wood and stone. What matters is staying free. But this is different. You chose this isolation, built this life deliberately. I have no right to force you to give it up because of my problems." "You're not forcing anything," Benjamin said gently. "We're choosing to help someone who matters to us." The simple declaration brought tears to her eyes that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. "Why? You barely know me." "We know enough," Josiah replied. Know you're brave enough to risk everything for your principles. Know you're kind enough to worry about strangers who've shown you hospitality. Know you're strong enough to survive in a world that tried to make you weak. And we know what it's like to run from people who think they own your life, Benjamin added. The only difference is we had nothing to lose when we left. You're sacrificing everything for the chance to be free. Isabel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that seemed both vulnerable and determined. If we do this, if we run deeper into the mountains, there's no guarantee we'll survive. Winter's not over, supplies are limited, and they'll keep hunting until they find us. Then we'd better make sure they don't find us, Josiah said simply. Outside, the sound of distant horses carried on the night wind, still far away, but close enough to remind them all that time was running short. Benjamin's military medal lay heavy in his palm, its bronze surface tarnished by years of deliberate concealment. The Congressional Medal of Honor had been hidden in a wooden box beneath loose floorboards for 15 years, buried along with memories of a war that had taught him too much about death and not enough about living. Now, as search parties closed in on their sanctuary, he found himself studying the ribbon's faded colors and remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. "Gettysburg," he said quietly, showing the medal to Josiah and Isabel as they huddled around their table, making plans. "Third day, when Pickett's charge broke against our lines. I held a position that should have fallen, kept firing when everyone else had retreated or died." Josiah stared at his brother with new understanding. "You never told me about this." "Some things are better left buried," Benjamin's fingers traced the medal's surface, feeling the weight of memories attached to it. "But if we're going to survive what's coming, you need to know what I learned about fighting when retreat isn't an option." Isabel reached across the table to touch his weathered hand. "What did you learn?" "That desperate men with nothing to lose are more dangerous than armies with everything to gain. That knowing the ground gives you advantages no amount of numbers can overcome. And that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to risk losing everything else." The tactical knowledge that had made him a decorated soldier began reshaping their escape plans. Where Josiah had suggested simply fleeing deeper into the mountains, Benjamin saw opportunities for misdirection and strategic advantage. Their pursuers expected to find either cowering refugees or empty wilderness. They wouldn't be prepared for organized resistance from men who understood both the terrain and the art of war. "They're using a standard military search pattern," he explained, sketching lines on paper with a charcoal stick. "Overlapping zones, coordinated timing, established checkpoints. Very effective against conventional targets, but it has weaknesses." "What kind of weaknesses?" Isabel asked, leaning closer to study his rough map. "Predictability. Once you understand their pattern, you can move through the gaps between search zones. Stay ahead of their sweep, use terrain they consider impassable, hit supply lines they think are secure." Josiah looked troubled. "You're talking about fighting them, not just avoiding them." "I'm talking about surviving them," Benjamin corrected. "These aren't just local trackers looking for reward money anymore. Some of those men I've spotted are professionals, bounty hunters, maybe even Pinkertons. They won't give up just because we disappear into the wilderness." The conversation was interrupted by Isabel's sharp intake of breath. She'd moved to the window and was staring down the valley with an expression of mingled fear and determination. There's smoke rising from the Miller cabin. 3 columns, very deliberate. Benjamin joined her at the window, immediately understanding the significance. The Miller place had been abandoned for 2 years, but someone was using it as a signal station. 3 columns meant searchers had found sign of their quarry and were coordinating with other teams. "How long before they reach us?" Josiah asked. 6 hours, maybe 8 if the snow slows them down, Benjamin estimated. "Not enough time to pack everything, but enough to take what we need for extended wilderness travel." They moved with practiced efficiency, born of years preparing for emergencies that had never come. Josiah gathered their best weapons and ammunition, while Benjamin selected tools and medical supplies. Isabel, despite their protests, insisted on helping, sorting through preserved food and winter clothing with hands that shook only slightly. "Take this," she said, pressing her gold locket into Josiah's palm. "If something happens to me, you can use it to prove I came willingly. Maybe it will protect you from the kidnapping charges." "Nothing's going to happen to you," he replied firmly, but he pocketed the locket anyway. The packing revealed how much their mountain life had expanded beyond mere survival. Books they'd accumulated over the years, chess sets and carved figures, pressed flowers and handwritten journals, all the small treasures that transformed a shelter into a home. Leaving them behind felt like a second exile, another abandonment of everything they'd built together. "I'm sorry," Isabel said quietly as they worked. "This is all my fault." "No," Benjamin said with quiet conviction. "This is the fault of people who think money gives them the right to control other people's lives. You're just the one brave enough to fight back." As afternoon shadows lengthened, they completed their preparations. 3 packs contained everything essential for survival: food, medical supplies, ammunition, basic tools. The cabin itself would tell no stories to their pursuers. They'd removed or destroyed anything that might reveal which direction they'd gone or how well prepared they were for extended travel. "One more thing," Benjamin said, retrieving a small leather pouch from their hiding place. Inside were gold coins they'd accumulated through years of trading furs and handcrafted goods. Emergency money. Enough to buy supplies or passage if we need to leave the territory entirely. The weight of that possibility settled over them all. Leaving Colorado meant abandoning not just their cabin, but their entire way of life, perhaps forever. Yet none of them spoke of surrender or turning back. As twilight approached, they made their final preparations. Weapons were loaded and checked, escape routes memorized, contingency plans discussed. Benjamin's military training showed in the thoroughness of their preparations and the calm efficiency with which they worked. "If we get separated," he instructed, "head for the old mine shaft near Eagle Peak. It's defensible, has water, and most people think it's been played out for years. We'll regroup there and decide our next move." Josiah took Isabel's hands in his, looking directly into her eyes. "Are you certain about this? Once we leave here, there's no going back to your old life. Your father will disown you, society will shun you, and you'll be living as a fugitive from your own family." "I'm certain," she replied without hesitation. "I'd rather live free in the wilderness than die slowly in a gilded cage." He kissed her then, gently but with all the emotion that had been building between them over the past days. When they separated, both Benjamin and Isabel could see that something fundamental had changed between them, a commitment that went beyond mere attraction or shared danger. "Time to go," Benjamin said quietly, shouldering his pack. They left the cabin as darkness fell, moving silently through snow that muffled their footsteps. Behind them, the warm glow from their windows faded into memory. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim chance of finding a life together beyond the reach of those who would force them apart. The hunt was beginning in earnest, but now the hunted were prepared to fight back. Cornelius Remington's gold pocket watch caught the morning sunlight as he snapped it closed, the engraved eagle on its surface gleaming like a promise of power. The timepiece had belonged to his own father, carried through the California goldfields, and later through the building of an empire that stretched from Denver's banking houses to the railroad yards of Kansas City. Now, it marked moments that could determine whether that empire would survive to see another generation. 2 hours behind schedule, he announced to the assembled search party, his voice carrying the authority of a man, accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The trail is fresh. They left that cabin sometime after midnight." Benjamin watched from a concealed position among the rocks above their abandoned home, studying the man whose influence had driven them into the wilderness. Cornelius Remington looked nothing like the ruthless industrialist of reputation. Instead, he appeared to be what he was, a worried father in his 50s, grey-bearded and travel-worn, whose expensive clothes couldn't hide the exhaustion etched into his weathered features. "Sir," one of the professional trackers called out, kneeling beside the cabin's front door. They left in a hurry but took time to cover their tracks. "These aren't panicked refugees. Someone here knows wilderness craft." "The Harwick brothers," Remington replied, consulting a leather folder thick with reports. "Benjamin served with distinction in the war between the states. Received the Congressional Medal of Honor at Gettysburg. Josiah managed one of the most successful farms in the territory before the drought. Neither man is a fool, and both have reason to distrust authority." The revelation that Remington had researched their backgrounds so thoroughly sent a chill through Benjamin's carefully maintained composure. This was no simple manhunt driven by wounded pride. It was a calculated campaign by someone who understood exactly what kind of men he was facing. Isabel stirred beside him in their rocky hiding place, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. They'd spent the night in a narrow cave that Benjamin had discovered years earlier, waiting to see what kind of force would arrive at their cabin. The answer was sobering: 12 men, including Remington himself, all well-armed and equipped for extended mountain travel. "Father," Isabel whispered, her voice carrying emotions too complex for easy categorization. "You know him?" Benjamin asked quietly. "Know him? He taught me to ride, to read, to think for myself. Everything that made me strong enough to run from his plans for my life." She touched the rock wall between them and the search party below. "He's not evil, Benjamin. Just afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of losing everything he built, of failing to protect the people who depend on him." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Of losing me to choices he can't understand or control." Josiah appeared at Benjamin's shoulder, having completed his reconnaissance of the surrounding area. 8 more men positioned around the perimeter," he reported in barely audible tones. "Professional placement, overlapping fields of fire. They're not taking chances. And there's something else," he added, his expression troubled. "Saw riders coming up from the south, hard men with the look of bounty hunters. Whatever this is about, it's bigger than just finding one runaway daughter." Benjamin studied the approaching riders through a gap in the rocks. Even at distance, their purposeful movement and military-style formation suggested capabilities that went far beyond simple tracking. These were men who specialized in violence, the kind hired when negotiation was no longer an option. "Blackthorn's men," Isabel said, having followed his gaze. "Father must have told him I was missing. Why would your intended husband send armed men after you?" "Because Harrison Blackthorn doesn't believe in accepting no for an answer." Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of personal experience with the man's character. "If he can't have me willingly, he'll take me by force and claim I was rescued from kidnappers." The tactical situation was becoming clearer to Benjamin's trained eye. Remington's search party represented official authority, legal, methodical, constrained by at least some regard for proper procedure. The approaching bounty hunters operated under different rules entirely, accountable only to whoever paid their wages and motivated by rewards that had nothing to do with justice. "We need to get closer," he decided. "Hear what they're saying, understand what we're really facing." Moving with skills learned during countless hunting expeditions, the 3 fugitives worked their way down through the rocks until they could overhear conversations in the valley below. What they learned changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. "Not just about the girl anymore," one of Remington's men was explaining. "Harrison Blackthorn's made it clear that anyone interfering with his plans will face serious consequences." "My daughter made her choice," Remington replied firmly. "I won't have her dragged back against her will." "With respect, sir, you may not have a choice. Blackthorn's got leverage over your railroad contracts, your mining operations, even your bank holdings. Cross him on this, and he'll destroy everything you've spent 30 years building." The pocket watch appeared again in Remington's. her hands, its steady ticking audible in the morning stillness. He stared at its face, as if seeing reflections of all the compromises and difficult decisions that had brought him to this moment. "Then we have a problem," he said finally, "because I won't sacrifice my daughter's happiness to save my business empire, even if it means losing everything. Everything I built was meant to provide for her future. What good is an empire if it costs me, the only person who matters more than the building of it?" Benjamin felt Isabel's sharp intake of breath beside him. The conversation below was revealing a father very different from the cold businessman she'd been running from. Whatever forces had driven them apart, love clearly remained beneath the surface of their conflict. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their eavesdropping as Blackthorn's men arrived. Their leader was a tall man with pale eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his lips. He dismounted with casual arrogance, surveying Remington's search party like a general reviewing troops. "Cornelius," he said, his tone managing to be both familiar and condescending. "Still playing the devoted father, I see. Still playing the concerned fiancé." Remington replied coldly. "Oh, I'm very concerned. Concerned enough to bring additional resources to ensure we find your wayward daughter before she freezes to death in these mountains." He gestured to his men, whose weapons and equipment spoke of expensive preparation. "My associates specialize in retrieving valuable property from hostile environments. My daughter is not property. Your daughter is my intended bride, which makes her my responsibility as much as yours." Blackthorn's smile widened, revealing teeth as cold as his eyes. "I have significant investments in her future, investments I intend to protect. And if she refuses to marry you, she won't have a choice. The kidnapping charges against whoever's been hiding her will ensure her testimony is dismissed as Stockholm Syndrome. A few months in a private sanitarium will help her recover from this unfortunate episode, and we can proceed with our original plans." The casual brutality of the statement hit Isabel like a physical blow. Benjamin felt her trembling beside him, whether from cold or rage he couldn't tell. The scope of Blackthorn's manipulation was becoming clear, not just coercion, but a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy her credibility and legal standing as an independent person. "Over my dead body," Remington said quietly. "That can be arranged," Blackthorn replied with the same pleasant smile. "Mountain accidents are tragically common, especially during winter rescue operations. Your death would be a great loss, but it would simplify certain business arrangements considerably." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Benjamin realized they were witnessing more than a family dispute. This was a power struggle between two men whose conflict would determine not just Isabel's fate, but the survival of everyone who stood in their way. The pocket watch snapped closed again in Remington's grip, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the sudden silence. Remington's business ledger lay open on the rough wooden table, like an accusation written in careful bookkeeper's script. The leather-bound volume contained more than just financial records. It documented a conspiracy that reached from Denver's most exclusive clubs to the halls of territorial government, a web of corruption and coercion that had taken Benjamin's military mind several hours to fully comprehend. "Railroad contracts cancelled without cause," Cornelius explained, his finger tracing entries that represented months of lost revenue. "Mining permits revoked on trumped-up safety violations. Bank loans called in early despite perfect payment histories. Blackthorn's been systematically destroying my business empire for the past 6 months, forcing me into a corner where marriage seemed like the only solution." The unlikely meeting had taken place in an abandoned prospector's cabin 2 miles from their original hideout. Remington had come alone despite his men's protests, following tracks that Benjamin had deliberately left for him to find. The risk had been enormous. One wrong assessment of the man's character could have meant capture or death for all 3 fugitives. "Why should we trust you?" Josiah had asked bluntly when the railroad baron first appeared in their temporary sanctuary. "Because I love my daughter more than my fortune," Remington had replied simply, "and because Harrison Blackthorne represents a threat to all of us that none of us can face alone." Now, hours later, the full scope of that threat was becoming clear through the evidence contained in Remington's private records. Blackthorne's reach extended far beyond simple business competition. He'd infiltrated territorial government, corrupted federal officials, and built a network of enforcers who operated outside any law except their own enrichment. He's not just after Isabel, Benjamin realized, studying correspondence between Blackthorne and various political figures. He's positioning himself to control the entire Colorado territory. Your daughter's marriage was meant to be the capstone of a much larger plan. Exactly. Remington's weathered face showed the exhaustion of a man who'd spent months fighting enemies he couldn't see clearly. My railroad connects the eastern territories to California. My mines supply silver to the federal mint. My banks hold mortgages on half the farms between Denver and the Kansas border. Marry Isabel, and he gains legal access to everything I've built. Isabel sat silent through much of this explanation, absorbing revelations about her father's business that she'd never been allowed to understand. Her education had been deliberately limited to social graces and cultural accomplishments, keeping her ignorant of the vast responsibilities that rested on her shoulders simply by virtue of her birth. "You should have told me," she said finally, "about the pressure he was applying, the threats against our holdings. I might have understood. I wanted to protect you from that knowledge," her father admitted. "Wanted you to choose marriage for love, not from fear of what would happen if you refused. Instead, I chose to run from what I thought was your greed, rather than stand with you against a real enemy." The reconciliation between father and daughter had been tentative at first. 15 years of misunderstanding and resentment requiring careful navigation. But as they talked through the night, sharing truths that had been hidden behind walls of protective deception, the bonds between them began to strengthen rather than strain under pressure. "The men Blackthorne brought aren't just bounty hunters," Remington continued, returning to more immediate concerns. "They're what he calls his acquisition specialists, killers who specialize in making problems disappear permanently." "How many?" Benjamin asked, his military training focusing on tactical realities. 12 that I saw, but there are probably more coming. Blackthorne doesn't take chances when he wants something badly enough. And he wants Isabel badly enough to commit murder? He wants what marrying her would give him control of the largest transportation and mining empire in the Colorado territory. Her personal feelings are irrelevant to his calculations. Benjamin studied the crude map he'd been sketching, marking positions and approaches around their current location. The abandoned mining camp, where they'd taken shelter, offered certain defensive advantages: high ground, clear fields of fire, multiple escape routes, but it also represented a trap if they were surrounded by superior numbers. "We can't just keep running," he concluded. "Blackthorne has resources to maintain pursuit indefinitely, and winter's working against us more than them." "What do you propose?" Remington asked. "We make a stand, choose our ground, use our advantages, and force a confrontation on our terms rather than his." Josiah looked troubled. "That means fighting professional killers with limited ammunition and no backup." "Not necessarily limited," Remington interjected. "I didn't come up here empty-handed." He led them outside to where his horse waited, revealing saddlebags packed with weapons and ammunition that spoke of careful preparation. Military-grade rifles, enough cartridges for an extended engagement, even a pair of Navy Colts that Benjamin recognized as top-quality sidearms. "Been planning this conversation for days," Remington explained. "Knew that if I found you, we'd either become allies or enemies. Preferred to be prepared for either possibility." The weapons represented more than just firepower. They symbolized trust being offered and accepted between men who'd been enemies by circumstance rather than choice. As they distributed ammunition and checked the mechanisms of unfamiliar rifles, A sense of shared purpose began to replace the wariness that had marked their initial encounter. "There's something else," Remington said, producing a leather portfolio filled with legal documents. Signed, affidavits detailing Blackthorn's illegal activities, copies of correspondence proving corruption, financial records showing how he's manipulated territorial law for personal gain. "Evidence," Isabel breathed, understanding the implications immediately. "Enough to destroy him in federal court, if we can get it to the right authorities in Denver." Her father's expression grew grim. "But only if we survive long enough to present it." The afternoon was spent in careful preparation, combining Benjamin's military expertise with Remington's knowledge of their enemy's capabilities. They established fields of fire, prepared fallback positions, and cached supplies at strategic points around the mining camp. Most importantly, they planned for multiple contingencies: victory, defeat, or the kind of tactical withdrawal that might save their lives, even if it couldn't save their cause. "If something happens to me," Remington told his daughter as they worked, "those documents need to reach Judge Morrison in Denver. He's one of the few territorial officials Blackthorn hasn't corrupted." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Isabel replied firmly. "We're going to survive this together, and then we're going to destroy the man who thought he could buy our lives like merchandise." As evening approached, they made their final preparations. Weapons were loaded and positioned at key defensive points. Messages were prepared for delivery to authorities in case any of them survived what was coming. Most importantly, they talked through scenarios and contingencies until each person understood their role in the coming confrontation. "Why are you doing this?" Isabel asked Benjamin as they checked their ammunition supplies one final time. "You and Josiah could disappear into the wilderness, leave Father and me to face Blackthorn alone. Why risk your lives for our family's problems?" Benjamin considered the question carefully before answering. 15 years ago, your father's bank foreclosed on our farm. Legally, properly, but it destroyed everything we'd worked to build." Isabel's face showed surprise and concern. "I didn't know." He didn't know either, probably. It was just business to him, another bad debt that needed collecting. Benjamin's voice carried old pain that had mellowed into something approaching understanding. But tonight, watching him choose his daughter's freedom over his business empire, I realized something important. "What?" "That sometimes good people make hard choices for reasons we can't see from the outside. Your father's not the man I thought he was 15 years ago. Maybe he never was." Josiah appeared beside them, having completed his circuit of their defensive positions. "Blackthorn's men are moving," he reported. "Saw campfires being lit about 3 miles down the valley. They'll probably attack at dawn." "Then we'd better get some rest," Benjamin said practically. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As darkness settled over the mining camp, 3 generations of conflict and misunderstanding began to transform into something stronger, a family and their chosen allies, united against forces that threatened everything they valued. The night air carried the sound of distant voices and the metallic click of weapons being prepared, but also something else, the quiet confidence of people who'd chosen to fight for what mattered most. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger, but tonight brought something rarer and more precious, the hope that doing right might actually triumph over doing wrong, if good people were willing to pay the price that justice sometimes demanded. Josiah's handmade rifle spoke with the precision of 15 years wilderness hunting, the sound echoing off canyon walls like thunder rolling through the mountain peaks. The weapon had been crafted during their second winter in the high country, each component carefully shaped and fitted until it shot truer than any factory-made firearm. Now it served a purpose its maker had never intended, defending innocent lives against men who valued nothing beyond their own profit. The first shot dropped Blackthorn's lead scout from his saddle before the man could signal his companions about the defenders' positions. Benjamin watched the body tumble into a snowdrift 50 yards below their rocky fortress, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and regret that came with taking a life in righteous cause. War had taught him that killing was sometimes necessary, but never easy for men who retained their humanity. "Clean shot," Remington observed from his position behind a fallen log, his own rifle trained on the approaching riders. "How many more?" 11 that I can see," Benjamin replied, studying the enemy's formation through a gap in the rocks. "But they're spreading out now, using cover. Won't be able to pick them off so easily." The mining camp they'd chosen for their stand commanded excellent views of the surrounding terrain, while offering multiple defensive positions among the abandoned buildings and equipment. Old mining carts provided mobile cover, while timber-reinforced excavations created natural trenches that could shelter defenders from enemy fire. Most importantly, the position offered 3 separate escape routes if their defense collapsed. Blackthorne himself remained well back from the initial assault, directing his men's movements from a position that kept him safely out of rifle range. Even at distance, his pale hair and expensive coat made him easily identifiable. Among the rough men he commanded, Benjamin noted the way the mercenaries moved: professional spacing, coordinated advances, tactical discipline that spoke of military training. "They know what they're doing," he warned his companions. "This isn't going to be easy." The first coordinated attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, forcing the defenders to split their attention and ammunition. Josiah held the eastern approach with his precision rifle, picking off targets that exposed themselves too carelessly. Remington covered the main trail with steady, methodical fire that spoke of hunting experience adapted to human quarry. Benjamin anchored their position at the camp's highest point, where his military training allowed him to direct their overall defense while engaging the most dangerous threats. Isabel crouched behind the stone foundation of an old assay office, reloading weapons and spotting targets for the men who were fighting to protect her freedom. Her father had insisted she stay in the safest position available, but she'd refused to remain completely passive while others risked their lives on her behalf. "Movement on the north ridge," she called out, pointing toward figures barely visible among the trees. Benjamin swung his rifle toward the new threat, firing quickly to suppress what looked like an attempt to flank their position. The shot went wide, but it forced the approaching men to seek better cover rather than continue their advance. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm of attack and response, with both sides testing each other's capabilities while looking for decisive advantages. Blackthorne's men had superior numbers and equipment, but the defenders held better ground and intimate knowledge of the terrain. More importantly, they were fighting for something that mattered more than money: the right to choose their own destinies without interference from men who treated human lives as commodities. Running low on ammunition, Josiah reported during a brief lull in the fighting. "Maybe 20 rounds left." "Same here," Remington confirmed. "They're wearing us down deliberately, forcing us to expend cartridges while they probe for weak spots." Benjamin assessed their tactical situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 3 years of civil war. Their defensive position was strong, but not impregnable. Their ammunition limited but sufficient for now, their morale high but likely to falter if the siege continued much longer. Victory would require either eliminating enough enemies to force withdrawal or finding a way to break the stalemate before their resources ran out. "They're massing for another push," he observed, watching enemy movement through the scope of his rifle. "Bigger this time, probably meant to overrun us through sheer numbers." The second assault came with greater coordination and determination than the first. Blackthorne's men advanced under covering fire from multiple positions, using smoke grenades to obscure their movement while closing distance to the defensive perimeter. The sound of gunfire became almost continuous, punctuated by shouts and the whistle of bullets ricocheting off stone. Josiah's rifle claimed 2 more attackers before they reached effective range, but others pressed forward with the grim persistence of men being well paid for dangerous work. One mercenary made it within 30 yards of their position before Remington's shot sent him tumbling backward into the snow. "Hold the line," Benjamin called out, his voice carrying the authority of command even in desperate circumstances. Make every shot count. The defenders' coordinated fire created overlapping fields of death that no individual attacker could cross alive. But the cumulative pressure was taking its toll on their ammunition reserves and their nerves. Victory in this kind of fighting went to whoever could maintain effectiveness longest, and Blackthorn's resources seemed nearly inexhaustible. As the immediate assault faltered and pulled back, Benjamin realized they'd won the first round, but not the battle. The enemy would regroup, adapt their tactics, and return with even greater force. Unless something changed dramatically, the next attack might be their last. The broken manacle lay twisted in the snow like a promise fulfilled, its iron links snapped by the force of Benjamin's rifle, shot at point-blank range. The shackle had been intended for Isabel's wrists, carried by Blackthorn's men to ensure their valuable cargo couldn't escape during transport back to Denver. Now, it served as testament to the futility of trying to chain someone whose protectors understood that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Blackthorn himself had finally entered the battle when his hired killers failed to break the defenders' position through conventional assault. The pale-eyed man approached under a white flag, his expensive suit somehow still, immaculate, despite hours of mountain warfare, his smile as cold and calculating as ever. "Enough," he called out when he reached speaking distance. "This has gone on long enough. I'm prepared to offer generous terms for Miss Remington's return." "The only terms we'll accept," Benjamin replied from behind his rocky barricade, "involve you riding away and never coming back. I'm afraid that's not possible. Too much has been invested in this venture to simply abandon it now." Blackthorn's voice carried the reasonable tone of a businessman discussing routine transactions. "But I am prepared to pay substantially for your cooperation." "We're not for sale," Josiah said flatly. "Everyone's for sale, my friend. It's simply a matter of finding the right price." Blackthorn gestured toward his remaining men, who'd taken positions that commanded the defensive perimeter. $5,000 for each of you, plus safe passage out of Colorado territory. Enough money to start new lives, anywhere you choose. Remington stepped into view, his rifle trained steadily on the man who'd tried to destroy his family. "What about my daughter's choice in this matter? Your daughter will learn to appreciate the advantages of her new position. Young women often resist arrangements that are clearly in their best interests, but they adapt quickly enough when presented with reality." The casual dismissal of Isabel's autonomy as a human being struck Benjamin like a physical blow. He'd seen this attitude before, during the war, among men who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of respect. Such men were often intelligent, sometimes even charming, but they lacked the fundamental humanity that made civilization possible. "Last chance," Blackthorn continued, producing the iron manacles from his coat. "Surrender Miss Remington willingly, and everyone walks away with substantial compensation. Force me to take her, and I guarantee that. None of you will survive the experience." "Then I guess we'll have to take our chances," Benjamin replied, raising his rifle to his shoulder. The final confrontation erupted with sudden violence that caught even Benjamin off guard. Blackthorn's men had been positioning themselves during the parley, using the conversation to gain tactical advantages that their leader's arrogance had just thrown away. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions as the mercenaries abandoned subtlety for overwhelming force. But the defenders had used the time wisely as well. Remington's shot took Blackthorn in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the manacles flying into the snow. Josiah's precision rifle eliminated 2 attackers in rapid succession, while Benjamin's military training allowed him to coordinate their fire for maximum effectiveness. Isabel proved her courage when it mattered most, as one of Blackthorn's men broke through their perimeter and charged toward her position. She didn't freeze or flee. Instead, she grabbed a mining pick from the abandoned equipment and swung it with desperate strength, catching the attacker across the temple and dropping him instantly. "That's for thinking I was helpless," she said grimly, standing over the unconscious mercenary. The battle's turning point came when Remington's methodical fire found the enemy's ammunition supply. The explosions scattered Blackthorn's remaining men and eliminated their tactical cohesion, transforming an organized assault into panicked flight. Those mercenaries who could still move began retreating down the mountain, abandoning their wounded employer to whatever justice his intended victims chose to dispense. Blackthorn himself lay propped against a boulder, clutching his wounded shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. His pale eyes held fury and disbelief that his carefully planned operation had collapsed so completely. "This isn't over," he gasped, as Benjamin approached with weapons trained on him. "I have resources, connections. You can't hide from me forever." "Maybe not forever." Benjamin agreed, but long enough. He gestured toward the leather portfolio that contained evidence of Blackthorn's criminal activities. "Your resources and connections are about to become legal liabilities. Federal judges take a dim view of corruption and conspiracy, especially when the evidence is this complete." The broken manacle caught sunlight as Benjamin picked it up, feeling the weight of iron that would never again constrain an innocent person. Around them, the mountain battlefield fell silent except for wind through the pines and the distant sound of retreating horses. "It's finished," Remington said quietly, lowering his rifle as he approached his daughter. "No," Isabel replied, embracing her father with fierce joy. "It's just beginning. The victory belonged to all of them, but the future belonged to those brave enough to choose freedom over security, love over obligation, and justice over profit." In breaking Blackthorn's power, they'd also broken the chains that bound them to a world where money mattered more than human dignity. The mountain air had never tasted so sweet. The wedding ring, carved from mountain wood, gleamed with the soft patina of hand-rubbed pine, its simple beauty reflecting the honest craftsmanship that had shaped it during Benjamin's long winter nights. He'd worked on it secretly for weeks, understanding that his brother and Isabel were building something that deserved recognition and celebration, even in the wilderness. The ring represented choices made freely, rather than arrangements imposed by others, love chosen over convenience, partnership over possession. Spring had come early to the Colorado Rockies that year, melting snow, revealing green shoots and wildflowers that transformed their mountain sanctuary into something approaching paradise. The wedding ceremony took place in a meadow above their rebuilt cabin, with Cornelius Remington performing the honors in his capacity as a territorial justice of the peace, a legal authority he'd rarely exercised until his daughter's happiness required it. "Do you, Josiah Harwick, take this woman to be your wife, to honor and protect her as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Josiah replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who'd found everything he'd never dared to hope for. "And do you, Isabel Remington, take this man as your husband, choosing freely the life you'll build together?" "I do," she said, her smile radiant as morning sunlight on fresh snow. The wooden ring slipped onto her finger with perfect fit, symbolizing not just their union, but the triumph of authentic values over artificial constraints. Around them, the mountain wilderness stretched endlessly, offering space for dreams that had no place in the civilized world below. Benjamin watched his brother's transformation with deep satisfaction. The careful reserve that had marked Josiah's character for 15 years had given way to something warmer and more open, as if love had reminded him of capacities he'd thought lost forever. Isabel had changed too, growing stronger and more confident as she mastered skills that refined society had never allowed her to develop. "You've both chosen a difficult path," Remington said as the brief ceremony concluded. "Life in these mountains won't be easy, especially for someone raised in comfort." "Comfort isn't the same as happiness," Isabel replied, taking her new husband's hand. "I'd rather face hardship with someone I love than live in luxury with someone I can't respect." The months following Blackthorn's defeat had brought changes none of them had anticipated. The evidence contained in Remington's business ledger had indeed reached federal authorities, resulting in a sweeping investigation that toppled corrupt officials from Denver to Washington. Blackthorne himself faced criminal charges that would likely keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life, his criminal empire dismantled and his political influence permanently broken. "The territorial governor wants to offer you both federal marshal positions," Remington had told the brothers during one of his regular visits to their mountain home. "Full authority to investigate corruption and enforce federal law throughout Colorado Territory." "Tempting," Benjamin had replied. "But we've had enough of other people's authority to last several lifetimes." Instead, they'd negotiated a different arrangement. Benjamin would spend part of each year in Denver, serving as a special consultant on matters requiring his military expertise, while maintaining his mountain home as a permanent sanctuary. The work paid well enough to ensure their independence while contributing something meaningful to the cause of justice. Josiah and Isabel had chosen complete withdrawal from the civilized world, building up a life together that drew its richness from simple pleasures and honest work. Their expanded cabin accommodated both comfort and practicality, with rooms for guests and workshops for the crafts that provided both income and satisfaction. "I never knew I could be this happy," Isabel confided to Benjamin one evening as they watched Josiah carve wooden toys for the children they hoped to have someday. "Father always told me that happiness was a luxury we couldn't afford, that duty mattered more than personal satisfaction." "Your father's learned some things too," Benjamin observed. "Watching him choose your freedom over his business empire changed something fundamental about his priorities." Indeed, Cornelius Remington had undergone his own transformation in the months since their mountain confrontation. His business empire, freed from Blackthorne's manipulation, had grown more profitable than ever, but he managed it now with greater attention to its effects on ordinary people. Workers received better wages, communities benefited from infrastructure investments, and his daughter's happiness had become the true measure of his success. "I spent 30 years building something I thought would last forever," he'd explained during their last conversation. "But I nearly lost the only thing that actually mattered, my relationship with the person I love most in this world." The wooden wedding ring caught firelight as Isabel adjusted logs in their hearth, her movements showing the competence of someone who'd mastered skills once considered beneath her station. She could hunt, fish, preserve food, and navigate wilderness terrain with confidence that would have amazed the society ladies who'd once been her peers. "Any regrets?" Josiah asked her, as they settled into their evening routine. "Only that it took me so long to realize what really mattered," she replied honestly. "I wasted years trying to please people who didn't deserve my consideration while ignoring the things that could have made me genuinely happy." Outside their windows, the mountain night settled around their sanctuary with the peaceful quiet that only true isolation could provide. No gaslights or city noise disturbed their rest. No social obligations demanded their attention. No artificial schedules constrained their time. They lived according to natural rhythms, seasonal changes, and the simple human needs for love, purpose, and security. "What do you think our children will make of this life?" Isabel wondered aloud. "They'll understand that freedom is worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve it," Benjamin replied from his chair by the fire. "And they'll know that the best things in life, love, family, honest work, can't be bought or sold, only chosen and protected." The carved wooden ring would someday pass to those children, carrying with it the story of courage that chose love over obligation, wilderness over wealth, and authentic life over artificial comfort. In choosing each other, Josiah and Isabel had also chosen a legacy that no amount of money could purchase and no degree of social pressure could corrupt. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness really do change everything, creating ripples that spread far beyond their original scope to touch lives and transform futures in ways that can never be fully calculated or contained.